Welcome everyone to the Bicentennial Mini-Science presentation for November 11th, 2021, coming to you from McGill University, located in Montreal, Canada. McGill is located on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe Nations. McGill has long recognized, honored, and acknowledged these nations as the traditional custodians of the lands and the waters on which we meet, exchange information, try to come to terms with things that are going on in the world, and acknowledge that we are all part of the land in everything we do. Today was a day of loss, a day where we recognized loss from the past, loss at a really weird time of global change. And we haven't had proper time to really understand the loss of the last 2 years. I know we probably should take a minute now, but we've probably done it today. So I just wanted to make sure we made a note of that we acknowledge today, November 11th, 2021. Our speaker for this evening will be introduced by the student ambassador, Audrey Gray.
Thank you, Ingrid. Hi, my name is Audrey Gray, and I am one of the student ambassadors for the Mini-Science lecture series, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you tonight's speaker, Professor Jennifer M. Welsh. Professor Welsh is the Canada 150 Research Chair in Global Governance and Security at McGill University, where she directs the Center for International Peace and Security Studies and is a Senior Research Fellow at Somerville College at the University of Oxford. Between 2013 and 2016, she also served as the Assistant Secretary General and Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on the responsibility to protect. During her research career, Professor Welsh has focused on a number of themes and institutions that relate to contemporary challenges in global governance, including humanitarian action, collective responses to genocide and war crimes, the protection of civilians in armed conflict, and the United Nations Security Council. As director of CIPSS at McGill, she is leading collaborative work to examine the future of UN peace operations and the challenges confronting the delivery of humanitarian relief in armed conflict. She is also initiating a new research program called International Institutions in Turbulent Times, which will analyze how global institutions respond to shocks and crises, and has recently launched with colleagues at Queen's and UBC, a new Canada-wide research network on women, peace, and security. Over the last few months, Professor Welsh has been completing an in-depth study of the breakdown in international cooperation during COVID-19 and options for reform of the global architecture to manage pandemic preparedness and response. In April 2021, Professor Welsh was elected an International Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She sits on the advisory board of the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt, the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, and the Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation. Her most recent book, The Return of History, Conflict, Migration, and Geopolitics in the 21st Century, was based on her 2016 Massey Lectures. As a student ambassador, I had the opportunity to speak with Professor Welsh over the summer, where among other things, we discussed her insight on the future within her field. I am very much looking forward to her expanding on them in tonight's lecture, The Future of Humanity and Global Governance. Please submit any questions you may have over the course of her talk via the link found below, and we will address them following her talk.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Audrey, for that introduction. And it's great to be with you as part of Mini-Science and to reflect on this big question of the future of humanity and global governance. I've been thinking about this lecture for some time and how to begin and end it. And in a way, I'm going to begin with history, ancient history, and begin with very current events. So what I'd like to do with you this evening is talk about the case for global governance, why we need to have governance at the global level, what the global governance landscape looks like today and going forward, and then really focus in on some core challenges and trends that are affecting global governance today, and end with some reflections on what COVID-19 has taught us about global governance. So the governance model that most of us are familiar with is the sovereign state, a creation of the early modern period. And this picture, which I love and I use in my teaching, is from the cover of a well-known book by Thomas Hobbes called The Leviathan, which showed how the earliest thinkers about the state conceived of governance. And you have here the king, the monarch, and all the people of his realm embodied in the sovereign. And so it was a very hierarchical model of governance. And of course, for Hobbes and those who were thinking about the rise of the state in the early modern period, they were very much looking for a silver bullet out of the turbulence and civil war that was raging across Europe. And the sovereign state offered that model, if you will. So the case for the state was really that it served a number of important functions. It created an island of order or islands of order, but it also provided a protective shell for self-determining communities. And it also facilitated collective efforts across states to bring about greater prosperity and justice. And there are many who would argue that the modern nation state has been the most effective governance technology that we've ever devised as humanity. It's enabled human societies to attain unprecedented levels of prosperity and security. But we've also seen gridlock beyond the state. We know that states trying to work together can also fail to cooperate. And some of the crucial problems we face today are beset by paralysis in policy making. And we also know that if we look around our world today, many of the traditional tools of interstate cooperation, intergovernmental organizations and treaties have proven to be inadequate. So if we think of global trade and the breakdown in the Doha round of trade negotiations, if we think of the climate negotiations that are taking place this week within the framework of the UN Framework on Climate Change, if we think of nuclear nonproliferation and the organizations and treaties designed to regulate it, or even financial reform of international financial flows, we can see that a number of processes are failing to deliver the results that humanity needs. And it would be tempting to chalk this up, this failure, this inadequate performance, if you will, to particularly troublesome states, to large power imbalances between the most powerful states in the system and weaker states, or to slow negotiations that seem to take forever, or as Greta Thunberg likes to say, the blah, blah, blah of international negotiations. But it's not only these factors, and I'm going to reflect a little bit later tonight on some powerful trends that are challenging global governance. But because our multilateral institutions rely on the participation and the consent of sovereign states, they often do reflect the lowest common denominator of ambition. And so, for example, if we think of the COVID-19 pandemic and we look to what the Security Council, which is pictured here, did or did not do, it's quite jarring to realize that it took the council months to pass a resolution in relation to COVID, but also to even place the issue of COVID-19 on the agenda of the UN Security Council, because China and the United States were sparring over what to call the virus and couldn't even agree to talk about it, let alone to place it on the agenda. So to sum up, we have a dilemma. It's clear that in an interdependent world, no individual state on its own, no matter how powerful or competent, can address pressing transnational issues like climate change, financial regulation, pandemics, or even terrorist networks. Nor can a state operating on its own really tackle challenges like global poverty. But how do we do this collectively? what mechanisms do we have? In a sense, the message I have for you tonight is that we're using 17th century institutional technology to confront 21st century challenges. We're using that Leviathan that Hobbes wrote about as the building block for tackling our common challenges of humanity today. So what lenses and approaches should we use to think about global governance? So here are two views from the Earth, of the Earth from above. And what I ask my students is to think about how the world can look different from 37,000 feet, depending on what you choose to focus on. There are some analysts of global governance today that look down at the Earth and see only sovereign states, and particularly the institutions that they create. But we can also choose to see other kinds of actors, other rules and arrangements that make up the complex world of global governance and global policymaking. So one of the first steps in thinking about the future of global governance to address the challenges facing humanity is to understand what's already out there, to look at the landscape and realize that there are many kinds of global governors, as I like to call them, in our contemporary world beyond just sovereign states. And so what have been some of the major changes in the landscape, the institutional and political landscape beyond the state that we need to think about today? Well, I want to briefly talk here about 5 of those. The first is the merging of domestic, or if you will, national politics and international politics. Many states today play what's been called in the political science literature a 2-level game. They play a domestic one, vis-a-vis important societal actors at home, and an international one, vis-a-vis other states. Other analysts have gone further to show how state preferences that they take into their international negotiations, or even a definition of the national interest itself, is really a function of the struggle among domestic groups. So we can see this with respect to Canada and its stance in climate change negotiations. That even defining that core Canadian national interest, what it is we seek to achieve, is a result of a domestic struggle between different parts of our polity who have different priorities and concerns. So that's one major change. The other is the rise of non-state and transnational actors, whether that be private companies, non-governmental organizations, powerful foundations, or even certain individuals, how they are now participating in governance beyond the state. Thirdly, we're seeing the emergence of what's called private governance, efforts in standard setting that are not led by sovereign governments, but by non-state actors. And I'll give you 2 examples of those. One is the Kimberley process on conflict diamonds, where it wasn't a set of states who tried to determine which diamonds should be for sale in our global marketplace, but a series of private companies working with NGOs to try to create a class of diamonds that were not produced and trafficked in conflict settings. So it was a major company, De Beers, working with a set of non-governmental organizations who came up with a set of standards and a certification scheme, an example of private governance. Another example are the Basel standards on banking that were created by a set of actors, economic actors, rather than states, to try to create a regulatory framework in which banks could globally operate. So these are private governance schemes that make up and form part of the landscape for global governance today. A fourth trend is the development of new means of securing compliance with rules. One of the great frustrations about global governance is that, unlike in the confines of the sovereign state, enforcement of the rules is notoriously difficult. States may sign up to certain agreements, but do they actually comply with them? And if they don't, what mechanisms do we have to hold them accountable? So what we found over the last couple of decades is new models for trying to bring about compliance that don't involve sanctions or punishment, because as we've seen, those sanctions and punishment mechanisms are very weak at the global level. So part of the way that we've done that, and we see this through the Paris Climate Change Agreement of 2015, is we've created instead softer targets, softer law, a set of ambitions or goals that states might have that they seek to self-report on. And we hope through that process of peer review of what states have done and haven't done, that we can create pressure on them to meet their commitments. And then finally, a big trend we've seen in global governance is the proliferation of different institutions and forms of cooperation. And that's given rise to the phenomenon of institutional complexity. And we see this very much in the field of global health governance, where we have the World Health Organization at the center, but a variety of other schemes of governance that exist alongside it. Whether we think of Gavi, which is the Global Alliance on Vaccines, whether we think of the Global Fund for Tuberculosis and Malaria that's led by foundations and particular states. So there's overlapping forms of governance in the same thematic area. It creates messiness, but many would argue that that complex helps to deliver better outcomes rather than relying just on one international or intergovernmental organization. So we can think about global governance as being comprised of a variety of global governors, those authorities who exercise power across borders for the purposes of affecting policy. And we can secondly think of a variety of governance tasks. These global governors, who might be states, but who might be companies, who might be non-governmental organizations, who might be foundations, are taking part in a variety of governance tasks. They might be simply setting the agenda for cooperative efforts among states, or they might be engaged in negotiation of potential solutions. They might themselves be part of the decision-making structure, or they might be involved in the implementation of decisions that are reached at a global level. They might also be involved in monitoring of state commitments and reporting on how far states have come in meeting their commitments, or they may be involved in enforcement. And so we see all kinds of roles that are divided among actors in global governance today. If you think about the International Panel on Climate Change, a group of scientists, it's playing the role of agenda setting, but also framing the issues. What's at stake in our current effort to get towards 1.5 degrees of warming? Other actors may be lobbying for change. Again, if you think about the environmental realm, we can think of Greenpeace as an actor that's doing that. Or actors might be providing particular expertise. Groups of scientists have played a critical role in global governance, in the environmental realm, but also in the realm of weapons of mass destruction. A lot of the key global governance actors today are also playing roles of naming and shaming, trying to mobilize action that's more productive towards solving problems. So a number of governance roles and a variety of global governance, global governors that we should pay attention to. But what else do we need to keep in mind? It's not just the macro level. We also need to think about views from below, how global governance looks from those who are affected by it on a daily basis. So here are two examples of how we can think about global governance from below. On the right-hand side is the Brejing refugee camp, which is the largest refugee camp in Chad, hosting refugees from both the civil war in South Sudan and the genocide in Darfur. And the lives of those in the camp have been shaped by the actions and inactions of different global governance institutions, the African Union, the United Nations, but also by the trade in arms and the trade in oil and cotton. And above all, the immediate daily lives of people in that camp are affected by the policies and programs of a particular agency of the United Nations, UNHCR, as well as linked organizations like the World Food Program and UNICEF, but also local NGOs like CARE, the Red Cross of Chad, and even the German Refugee Agency. The immediate daily life in the camps is initially about crisis response, trying to get access to water, medicine, proper accommodation, combating disease, for example. But then the lives of people in this refugee camp diverge considerably, depending on whether they are recognized as an official or an unofficial refugee. For the former, for official refugees, there's registration, identity cards, access to food and firewood. But for the unregistered, life is more precarious. And the message I want to send to you is that it's the decisions of global governance mechanisms and global governors which will determine which camp those populations fall into. Do they fall into the camp of the registered refugee or the unofficial refugee? And that determination will make a huge difference in terms of the kind of accommodation they receive and the kind of safety that they live under. The second image here is of the grain market in Canna City. Now, we know in our own daily lives that the cost of our grocery basket is affected by things like inflation and trade rules. But these kinds of forces also shape the lives of the grain traders in Canna. Global governance for grain traders comes via commodity markets that are local, national, regional, and global. And the behavior of the traders that you see in this picture is shaped by the rules that are governing those markets. Who's allowed to trade, the social networks that facilitate access, where grain is stored, and the health regulations that affect the grain market. Market performance, financial crises, and a range of other factors can affect their livelihoods for good or for bad. And local producers are influenced by these factors on a daily basis. So some might participate in microfinance schemes by the World Bank. They also might be part of the Food and Agriculture Organization's assisted programs for pest control or climate change mitigation. So global governance touches the ground. It very much touches the lives of people in the refugee camp you see here or in the grain market. So now that we have a rough framework for thinking about what global governance is and how it is experienced, let me move on to talk about some of the big trends today that are affecting the shape and the quality of global governance. And I have 6 that I want to go through in the remainder of my remarks. So I'm going to go at quite a brisk speed, but I hope I'll give you an overview and a sense of how global governance is being affected by those. So the first, and probably the one that you're most familiar with, is the dramatic change that we're seeing in the distribution of power globally. In 1945, when the process of creating global institutions like the UN was launched, the United States was at the apex in terms of its global power. It represented, by some estimates, 50% of global GDP in 1945. But today, as we know, the global configuration of power is undergoing a profound shakeup. And there's 2 elements of this that I want to highlight for you. The first is the rebalancing of economic and political power from the West towards Asia. And the second is the increase in south-south interactions, particularly south-south trade. So let me just mention a few points about the first, the so-called rise of Asia as a center of power. Between 1995 and 2019, the group of 7 countries' share of global GDP fell by over 20%. And of course, this rebalancing is driven predominantly by Asia's rise, or rather, you might say its reemergence as a center of economic and potentially political power. So many describe us as entering a new Asian century. As of 2015, Asia already contained half of the world's middle class. But over the next decade, a staggering 88% of the growth of the global middle class is expected to take place in Asia. And of course, China and India are particularly important players in this evolving story. But we're also witnessing a more general rise, rather than the rise of Asia, rise of the rest phenomenon that's also driven by other countries, whether we think of Indonesia, Turkey, or even Ethiopia. So by 2050, 20 of the top 32 leading economies in the world are expected to be from the non-Western world. And this new assertiveness of the global South will also be seen in the political and security domains. And we're already seeing aspects of that shift. So for example, the contributions of developed and developing countries to UN peace operations has changed dramatically. Developing countries are now the biggest contributors to that form of global governance. Another trend I want to show here is the growing density of South-South interactions. So the proportion of global trade between countries of the global South jumped from just under 8% in 1980 to close to 30% in 2011. And it's growing on a daily basis. So while for 70 years, the United States stood at the center of a Western-oriented liberal international system, organized around openness, rules, multilateral cooperation, that hegemonic order is today undergoing a profound change. And when we think about the relative decline of the United States, we should think of it not just in terms of the economic statistics that I've showed you here, but also in terms of its soft power. The relative decline of the American model in terms of its attractiveness, its magnetic pull for other countries around the globe. But there's also a set of risks associated with this first trend that I want to highlight for you. First, we know that power transitions, from the history books tell us this, are periods of instability. So what we have in our current moment is a greater risk of conflict between what some call the G2, the United States and China, with many states caught in the middle. And of course, sitting in Canada with the recent release of our 2 Michaels, we know what being caught in the middle feels like. But we also have a risk that global governance generally will be infused with great power rivalry. We've seen this particularly in global public health, where the United States and China are competing very vigorously over things like vaccine diplomacy, but also leadership in global health as the pandemic eases. And then finally, we're seeing a declining legitimacy and even an effectiveness of institutions that don't reflect the power shift that we're seeing today. So we have countries of the global South asking legitimately why some institutions are still configured in ways that privilege states from the West, particularly the UN Security Council, but we can think of others as well. So the second trend I want to highlight is the retreat of democracy globally. 3 decades ago, it seemed as though the march of freedom and openness was unstoppable. But today, the NGO Freedom House has shown very dramatically that democracy is in retreat. What you see on this slide is a representation of the number of states who have seen gains in their levels of freedom as measured by a certain number of indicators against the number of states who have seen losses in freedom. And as you can see, over the last 14 years, countries with net declines in their aggregate freedom measures have outnumbered those with gains. Now, so this democratic downturn, if you will, has been underway for the last decade and a half, but it's been particularly steep in the past 5 years. Countries that not long ago were praised for making democratic transitions, like Hungary, the Philippines, Poland, Turkey, are backsliding into forms of illiberal and in some cases authoritarian rule. And these developments challenge the reigning assumption that we had at the turn of the millennium that the slow diffusion of democracy to all parts of the world was just a matter of time. What's more striking is that established democracies are also part of this decline, and they're absorbed by their own political challenges. The long-term consequences of the 2008 financial crisis have fostered disillusionment in many established democracies about what democracy can deliver, as well as and here we also have the challenge of the appeal of populist movements within established democracies. So some political scientists have identified a prospect that seemed unthinkable in 1989 at the end of the Cold War, and that's what they call a process of democratic deconsolidation, in which citizens of prosperous and mature democracies start to become predisposed towards alternative political systems. Now, this retreat of democracy is particularly challenging for global governance when it is infused with populist politics. So we see today in populism a strain of anti-elitism and an opposition to globalization, not just economic globalization, but globalization in terms of the free movement of people, that is posing really severe challenges for global governance. And I'll just mention 3 here, but we could discuss this for hours. First of all, we see very clearly in populist leaders and populist movements the rejection of expertise or ideas from international institutions. But we also see an unwillingness to delegate forms of sovereignty to arrangements that exist at the international level for cooperation. In order to have cooperative arrangements globally, there's a degree to which states must be willing to pool or delegate portions of their sovereignty. But as we know, the populist mantra today is take back control, guard your sovereignty, protect your nation. And then lastly, of course, we have different calculations of the benefits and costs of international cooperation. And we have scapegoating, particularly of globalization, for some of the domestic ills that are affecting both established democracies and states that are democratizing. So what are some of the risks we might see? We see increasingly a scapegoating of international institutions. We saw this during the pandemic with the WHO. But we also see populism bringing about instability in states that have been pillars within international institutions. The United States, of course, is the most obvious one, but there are others we can think of here that the signs are very worrying in terms of their commitment to continue working in multilateral frameworks. I would also name Brazil here as being a state which over the last 15 years has been incredibly productive and constructive within multilateral institutions, but under a current populist government is retreating from that kind of role. So let me move on to our third risk then, a fracturing of the multilateral system. It's become commonplace to hear that many of the traditional tools of cooperation that were created in the wake of World War II are proving inadequate to the challenges that we face. And I think here it's important to remember that multilateralism is not failing everywhere. Some forms of international cooperation, including, for example, among scientists and public health experts during COVID, are becoming more frequent and more powerful. But we do see particular multilateral institutions under enormous strain. The WTO, I would cite as one that is particularly susceptible to some of the challenges that I've been talking about. So why do we have particular multilateral institutions today struggling under the weight of some of these trends? Well, firstly, as I alluded to a few moments ago, we have increasingly irreconcilable differences in interests between major powers. We can see that within the UN Security Council today, its failure to agree on collective action to address a number of civil wars, and also the capacity of particular states to sabotage international agreement on key issues that affect them. The second problem with some of our multilateral institutions is that they have very weak, or in some cases non-existent, enforcement mechanisms to hold rule breakers to account. So there's often a huge gulf between treaty promises that states will make and concrete steps they take to fulfill their commitments. And then finally, a critique that we see of multilateral today, including the UN Security Council, the International Monetary Fund, also the WTO, is that they fail to reflect the growing power and influence of non-Western states. And that drains them of legitimacy in the eyes of many countries of the global South, who feel that the special responsibilities that were allocated to states from the global North are an anachronism in today's world, and that we need to move towards a more inclusive and representative global governance system. So, capturing multilateral system, what are some of the risks that we need to look out for? Well, the first, and I am reluctant to say it because I don't want to be accused of being a doomsdayer, but if I look at a lot of the war games that are being conducted in military establishments around the world, the risk is of a new great power hot war, or what is sometimes called peer-to-peer conflict. We had 2 decades where most of the conflicts we saw were either civil wars with international involvement or so-called asymmetric conflicts between powerful states and less powerful actors. But increasingly, militaries around the world are preparing for peer-to-peer conflicts. And the breakdown in our multilateral system in mechanisms of trying to prevent disputes between powers descending into war is a cause for great concern. The other risk we have is a complete collapse of the multilateral trading system under the rubric of the WTO. It's been exceedingly difficult to get to a new round of negotiations. The dispute resolution mechanism in the WTO is being hampered by a lack of court appellate body judges to render decisions. And so what we are increasingly seeing instead are bilateral trade agreements or trading blocks building up that really question the image or the goal of a global free trade. And then finally, we're seeing more and more bilateral or plurilateral approaches to global governance, where states come together in smaller groups or engage with one another bilaterally to try to achieve their objectives. Now, on the one hand, you might be thinking, why is that necessarily so bad? Sometimes you do need to work bilaterally. And if we think about just what has happened in the last couple of days, China and the United States on the sidelines of the COP negotiations have reached their own agreement on committing to work towards the 1.5-degree target. And this is an important step to facilitating broader agreement among states. But we need to remember what multilateralism offers to those who are not great powers. Multilateralism at its core provides a way to dilute the strength of powerful states, to ensure that rules that are agreed upon benefit a wider set of countries. It's very dangerous for smaller states to be in bilateral relationships with those that are more powerful than them. It's harder for them to attain their interests. So that's a risk we see, particularly for a state like Canada. Let me move to the fourth trend, the changing nature of conflict. Contemporary, and it's interesting to be talking about this on Remembrance Day, because contemporary conflict today bears little resemblance to the wars that were formative for our parents or our grandparents. Conflicts are much more likely to be within states rather than between them. And those civil wars, as we call them, are also becoming increasingly protracted. In addition to that, we see that much of the contemporary lethal violence that we see doesn't really occur in countries in formal states of armed conflict. The majority of states that are most affected by high levels of insecurity today, if we think about El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Venezuela, those states are not officially at war, as an international lawyer might define it. Instead, they are in the grip of criminal and political violence that is not deemed to have reached the threshold of a formal armed conflict. They're called by the International Committee of the Red Cross situations other than war. But yet we know that individuals who live in those societies live with really, in some cases, intolerable levels of personal insecurity. Now, what does this changing nature of conflict mean for us and for global governance? Well, firstly, it means that we're seeing more and more forced migration at a global level. And the composition of migration is really interesting. I have a slide here for you from 2016. You see that the total number of displaced people worldwide, close to 70 million, it's higher than that now. But look at the amount that are refugees, the dark blue, versus those who are internally displaced. Many of the displaced populations that are in countries today, those populations never reach a border. They never make a border crossing to become refugees. They are instead held hostage within their own nation states and displaced. And that's a phenomenon that is very difficult for global governance, because we have mechanisms for refugees, those that cross borders. We have very few mechanisms for those internally displaced. So a few other risks from the changing nature of conflict that are important to mention. Secondly, beyond forced migration is the reversal in development gains that we're seeing as a result of protracted civil conflicts. Syria, I think, is the best example of this. We are now a decade into the Syrian civil war. We have seen that country reverse by 30 years its economic development. And the World Bank estimates that many of the countries today that are experiencing development challenges are also likely to fall into situations of conflict, making this challenge even greater for us. And then, of course, we have other spillover effects from protracted civil wars. We have the rise of terrorism, we have criminal gangs, we have a number of transnational threats that develop from civil war conflicts. The fifth trend I want to mention that's important for global governance is the digital transformation. It is, of course, one of our most fundamental trends shaping the future of humanity. It's transforming political systems, and economic models. Now, I know you've had a whole lecture on AI and some of the and some digital technologies during the course of this mini science series, but there are a number of things for us to keep in mind about the digital transformation for global governance and particular risks that it represents. The first and perhaps most dramatic risk is a security risk. For most countries around the world, including Canada, the security of cyberspace has become a basic condition of survival. Vital government functions, ranging from the collection of taxes to the provision of public services, rely on robust computer systems and networks. The Canadian economy and industry also depend on complex machines and networks. All of those functions and activities have become increasingly vulnerable to intentional cyber disruption through the use of malware or denial of services attack. So there's a real security threat as a result of the digital transformation that has become a key concern for global governance. Secondly, there's a set of structural risks because the move to outsource the control and governance of this critical infrastructure to a small number of global companies generates a deep structural challenge for us. Those companies fall within the domain today of two competing regimes: a US firm-centric set of companies whose primary motive is the capturing and optimizing of data collection in the interests of shareholder value, and a Chinese model whose primary aim is the capturing and optimizing of data for social control. So both are developing technological capacities that sit largely ungoverned and with limited transparency or accountability. We also see a lot of digital activity untaxed and the value from that activity not made available for the purposes of global governance. Interestingly, we're starting to see this tackled through things like a global corporate tax, which is being discussed actively by the G7 and the G20. Finally, as a risk, we have a set of existential risks coming from the growth in surveillance technology, automated warfare, and of course, what we are starting to hear more and more about, sentient artificial intelligence. So these are, in a sense, existential risks for us to come to grips with through our global governance mechanisms. Finally, let me end with a further set of trends and risks that are very much at the top of mind for those engaged in global governance today. And those are what we might think of as catastrophic risks. Climate change at the top of the agenda when we think about catastrophic risks, but also, given that that's very much in the news, I wanted to also discuss risks that are related to weapons of mass destruction and pandemics, and I will end with those. I think in the realm of weapons of mass destruction, this is a trend and a development in global governance that perhaps we didn't expect 20 years ago or 30 years ago. When the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union and the United States agreed to moderate their relations, and indeed we saw the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we saw a dialing down of the nuclear threat. But when we look around the world today, we've seen a revival of concerns about the possibility of a nuclear war. We've seen nuclear proliferation, and we've also seen greater concerns about biological warfare. And so weapons of mass destruction have very much returned to the front burner of global governance when we think about disarmament and arms control. In addition to that, of course, even before COVID-19, we had concerns about the risk of pandemics as a catastrophic risk for humanity. And so what did COVID-19 reveal for us, and what might it have changed? Let me conclude on that before I take your questions. Well, I think what COVID revealed for us is the degree and depth of interdependence that we have in our 21st century world. The degree to which events in the smallest corner of the world can come to affect what we do in our daily lives. We had a curfew in Quebec. We had to come into our houses at 8 p.m. as a result of a pandemic that began in a very different part of the world. But secondly, COVID revealed for us the extent and nature of inequality within and between societies. I know from speaking with our current ambassador to the United Nations in New York, Bob Ray, that one of the issues that is on the minds of many global governors is the economic inequality that has resulted from COVID, both across societies and within them. We've also seen COVID reveal the fragility of democratic systems. Many democracies performed very badly during the pandemic. You couldn't predict performance by political system. The performance was all over the map in terms of democratic states doing well and badly, autocratic states doing well and badly. But COVID also, I think, revealed for us the extent and implications of the global power shift. It also brought home to us the inherent difficulties in international cooperation, and it reminded us profoundly of the ways in which politics continue to matter. The different policies that were adopted in different jurisdictions were political decisions. A pandemic could not be solved just by technical solutions. It required governors, and it required governors to make decisions that affected our daily lives in very dramatic ways. So what COVID may have changed, and I'll end with this, it may have changed the way we evaluate who and what is a successful country globally. We used to believe that countries like the United Kingdom, the United States were incredibly successful countries. How do we feel about that 18 months on and look at how they fared in the initial stages of the pandemic versus other countries? COVID may have changed as well the development trajectory of many states and the return we know of extreme poverty. But I also think that, and I'll end on this point, that COVID very much changed the relationships between the developed North and the global South. That we've seen a reshuffling of the board, if you will. And when we think about what the governance of pandemics will look like going forward in particular, I predict that we are going to see the global South asking for a particular set of solutions that begins to address their concerns rather than just the concerns of the global North. So I know that my talk tonight has been very much about the trends that are challenging global governance. We do have tools and mechanisms, but it is a very different landscape from the one that existed 20 years ago. And so I hope those of you who are under 30 and listening to this talk are going to feel empowered and energized to take part as global governors to attack some of these global challenges that we're facing. And Audrey, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you so much. So we have a few questions, and I guess I will just read them out now. So our first one is, hi, Dr. Welsh, do you think that the future of humanity is positive?
Ooh, well, there's a debate on this, right? You have those like Steven Pinker, who would argue that we're seeing an upward trajectory despite downward periods in prosperity, in levels of violence, and that therefore we shouldn't be too gloomy about the future of humanity. I take a more pessimistic view. I think that some of the trend lines we're seeing are pointing us in the direction of important reversals. And because my own value system values political freedoms, I think particularly the democratic recession is one that I worry about a great deal. But I think I also worry about our capacity to globally govern technology. And I think unless we can do that collectively, the future of humanity is very, in my mind, is very much in doubt. Because I think we could see some very rapid developments there that could outstrip our capacity to address things like sentient AI, cybersecurity, concerns about cybersecurity. So I'm a little bit more gloomy than some other commentators.
Okay, our next question is, what are your thoughts on a world government being necessary to solve global issues such as inequality, climate change, racism, etc.?
It's a great question. And, you know, schemes for world government have been more prolific than you might think. So, you know, when I showed you that very first slide of the Leviathan and the hierarchy towards the king at the top, of course, there's an argument that says the way to solve our problems is to leave our disorder. Hobbes was writing about disorder as civil war, is to leave our disorder and opt for a world state. And I think what's sometimes called supranationalism, so authority that exists above the state and which does not have the consent of sovereign states, is something that many have pointed to as the only solution to some of these collective action problems. But I think the trend of populism that I talked about, and also a trend I didn't mention, which was a trend towards localization and local solutions, suggests that a world government is going to remain normatively unattractive for many, because the worry will be that that's a tyrannical solution, that power from above simply won't be able to allow for and incorporate enough local solutions. And by that, I mean even local below national states. And so I think it's difficult to reconcile democratic politics with world government, but even more difficult to reconcile what many in civil society are calling for, which is a greater deference to local solutions. We're seeing this with climate change, that the answer may not even be at the state level, it may be at a local level, and we have to allow that to flourish.
Okay, do we have time for one more question, Ingrid?
Yes, you do.
Okay, great. So the third question is, how does the role of the internet contribute to the populist challenge?
It's a great question. And I think it's a very interesting question for global governance. I think it contributes enormously in two ways. And I spoke about this as a challenge to global governance generally, that if you are going to have cooperation at an interstate level, you need to defer or at least receive cues and information from objective and expert sources. And we can talk about how those operate globally. We have it in the form of scientific experts. We have it in the form of judges. We have it in many forms. But populism challenges that in significant ways through its anti-elitism and its questioning of expert views, but also because of the disinformation and misinformation that is rampant in populist discourses. And of course, the internet, you know, we hear some pushing back and saying, you know, we've always had propaganda, we've always had disinformation. But I think social media and the internet have made this phenomenon exist at a scale and at a speed that is simply qualitatively different. You can have populations literally living in parallel universes. And I think that is very difficult for national governance, let alone global governance.
Thank you so much for such a mind-blowing presentation. This series, Mini-Science, usually focuses on scientific issues. You're the first economist, first political theorist that we've hosted, and I've really enjoyed it. I get to gift you officially. You will receive from us the official outreach face masks. Science Outreach has prepared these.
Great.
You will be receiving from the Red Path Museum. We are not open now. We are open for classes, but we are not open to the public, but we have publications. One publication is called Treasures from the Earth. This is all the mineral gallery specimens in a booklet form. Lots of great photos. It will be sent to you in the mail. I hope you can enjoy the mineral collection, even though you can't come here in person. For the kids, this is a wonderful activity book in French prepared by students in the STEM and diversity group at McGill. And finally, just a small thing. This is a stereoscope. It will, once you open the cellophane, you will, turn it into a box, and you'll be able to look through the back end here and have a stereoscopic view of Gorgosaurus liberatus, the dinosaur at the Red Path.
Oh, I love it. Thank you so much. And thank you, Audrey. It's great to be in touch over these past several months. And I hope we stay in touch.
Yeah,
these lectures,
so
these whole, sorry, Audrey, the entire series will be preserved and archived on YouTube, McGill YouTube. You can watch this, but we will also be preparing a website based on the oral histories we took of each of the speakers. Well, I'm speaking collectively for all the student ambassadors who worked on this project. They began working on this, it was 2020, November 2020, when the student ambassadors signed up. To be continued. Next month, our final speaker in the series is Suzanne Fortier. She is the principal of McGill. She will be with us December 9th. You don't have to pre-register, 6 o'clock. It will be McGill YouTube online presentation. The title of her talk is The Future of the University. See you back here in about a month's time. Good night, everyone.
Good night.